IVT's Validation Week is going virtual for 2020 this October. Not to be confused with a single presentation webinar or Zoom training, Val Week 2020 brings a completely virtual 3-day conference experience. With nearly 30 expert speakers and a combination of live and on-demand sessions crafted with your time in mind, the caliber of training content is unrivaled. Hear from top pharma, biotech, and medical device subject matter experts, gain exclusive insights from FDA speakers, build up your team's validation toolkit with take-home checklists and materials, and leverage unlimited networking opportunities with colleagues and key decision makers. Plus, claim up to 15 credit hours toward GMP training requirements. You won't want to miss it. Visit www.informaconnect.com/validation week for all details on agenda and registration. Once again, that's www.informaconnect.com/validation-week for all event details.
This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with life science experts and discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, I am happy to welcome Kevin Hansen. He's a pharmacist with Cone Health and Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital. It's great to have you with us today, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be a really exciting conversation as we talk about innovations in drug preparation and administration, specifically your work with Ready-to-Administer Syringes and using IV robotics to help get that done. And just to set the stage a little bit for our listeners, the use of intravenous medications is essential to proving patient care in the hospital setting, which is where you are. Various studies have indicated that nearly half of IV medication errors happen during preparation or administration. With the introduction of ready-to-administer syringes, the number of bedside preparations decreased, and with it, the likelihood of adverse medication errors. So these innovations that we're talking about today in the RTA space are changing the way that some hospital systems like yours and their compounding pharmacies, it's changing the way you source these kinds of drugs. And I'm really happy to talk about this because we don't get a lot of content for the compounding folks. And this is just a really important innovation. So thank you for agreeing to talk with us about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Kevin, to kick us off here, help us understand the evolution to RTA syringes. IV drugs are administered regularly in hospitals, as we mentioned, for patient care and treatment. So when did we begin to link bedside preparation and manual preparation in hospital with preventable adverse drug events?
Yeah, great question. And I think we do need to start by looking at the historic practices and even going back to the 50s and 60s and the 70s to see, how were IVs or, drugs provided to patients during that time. And actually it was very nursing driven. So we had this workforce put on nursing where they had to acquire the drugs, they had to mix the drugs, whether that's reconstituting and drawing it up. They potentially had to label the products, and then they had to perform all of the things necessary to ensure to get it to the patient. So connecting it to the access devices, going through the 5 rights to make sure it's the right patient, the right drug, the right route, and then administering it and doing it at the correct rate. And when you take a step and take a step back and look at that, that's a lot of opportunities where errors can occur.
It seems like a lot of weight on their shoulders. And then, of course, if something happens, that's a lot of responsibility as well.
Absolutely. And really the evolution, as we kind of talk through as it goes throughout the years, is we started recognizing the importance of sterility for these products,
of course,
using parenteral drugs. And so then the question was really asked, well, is preparation at the bedside best practice? And that's when pharmacies started coming through with clean rooms and with laminar airflow hoods. And slowly over time, pharmacies started to say, hey, this is what we can provide to help with these patients, as we are the drug experts. We know the compatibility and where the evidence is about the proper dilutions of these and having access to all those ingredients. And so we saw a big shift from this hands-on nursing of doing this preparation to pharmacy. And then even looking at the error rates, there were some great studies done about nursing admixture programs that showed that there was an identified error rate, right? So we know that errors occur sometimes without our knowledge. That was over 22%, right? And so thinking about the critical nature and some of these even drugs being high alert, 22% is a very high error rate. And of course, that comes with a lot of harm to patients as well.
Sure, absolutely. So it sounds like now we're readily using ready-to-administer products. And would you say that that's the IV drug delivery system of choice at this point for, most hospitals and health centers?
Yeah, absolutely. When, and going off of the error rates and the opportunities that we just discussed with all those steps, having a product that's ready to administer means there's no further manipulation needed. It doesn't need reconstitution. It doesn't need activation. You don't need to add it to a bag. It's ready to administer to that patient. So connecting it to the access device and going. So significantly minimizing the number of steps. And so our leading safety organizations like the Institute of Safe Medication Practices, ISMP, right. They even go out and say as their best practice guideline, it says to the maximum extent possible, we need to ensure that we're using ready to administer products. And sometimes even taking a step back and say, well, what products are we providing within a hospital setting, for example, that have opportunities that we could get to a ready to administer, whether that's, hey, we need to purchase it. It's available through an FDA manufacturer. We could outsource it. Right. And have it come in from a 503B, or is that something that we have the technology and capabilities of insourcing and compounding that within house? So then when it gets to the provider or to the nurse or whoever is doing that administration, there's very little manipulation left to do to get that drug to the patient. And so looking at the evidence and looking at the error rates, it is the safest type of product that we can provide to our patients.
And Kevin, so is it the responsibility of pharmacists, compounding pharmacists like yourself, then to decide whether you have, whether you develop these in-house or whether you outsource them, or is that decision made somewhere else?
I think pharmacy is the best to come to the table with the options.
Okay.
Some of the other groups that, when we met with our anesthesia providers within our operating room, they were not even aware that some of these were even an opportunity to have it into a ready to administer or pre-filled syringe. And some of them would come to the table to say, hey, I worked at this other institution and they had this in a pre-filled syringe. Why don't we have that here? And so that's really where we began the conversation with our anesthesia providers. And then we said, well, let's not look at that one drug that was requested. Let's look at all the drugs that are most commonly used in that setting to see where we have some opportunities to make some conversion. And so several years ago, we did that evaluation, and that really was our kickoff to providing ready to administer syringes in that setting.
And that seems like, the best approach, right? Because then you have all of the things you might possibly need sort of ready to go. And you're not having to compound something special, at the time that you need it, which I imagine there's issues with that. There can be, integrity issues with that too. Yeah. What would you say are the primary issues with outsourcing at this point in time?
Yeah, good question. And so, 503B outsourcing compounders are relatively new, at least when we look at the history of compounding. It's, now recognized as by the FDA, and there's some guidance there with current good manufacturing practices. But, there's, currently as of today, there's just over 80 of them in the nation. And so it is relatively new. And so some of the issues that we see is, is 80 enough? And, to meet the patient demands. And through drug shortages, material shortages, and allocations, we're finding that they're really not able to keep up with the demand when we have those types of swings in the supply chain, and it becomes really challenging. And so we see restrictive allocations put on hospitals or folks that are purchasing to say, hey, I know you're requesting 100, for example, but we can only send you 80.
Right.
And so it puts hospitals in really difficult situations that, we're getting less than what we need to take care of our patients. And so what do you do? And so
yes, what do you do?
Yeah,
are you left then to try to compound the rest in-house or?
So I'll use a specific drug as an example. So the drug rocuronium. So rocuronium comes in a vial, and we wanted to make it into a ready-to-administer syringe. So we reached out to our outsourcers. We were able to get rocuronium in a pre-filled syringe, and we were able to stock those right in our operating room so our providers could take them out and administer it the moment that they need it. Well, when we don't have enough to meet the needs, to fill the cabinets and to put into those areas to take care of how many cases are in that room for the day, well, we're left to putting a vial into there because at least at the time we didn't have our IV robotics program, which we'll discuss. We didn't have a sterility testing program, so we didn't really have a good method to provide that into a ready-to-administer syringe without requiring refrigeration, which was pretty absent in the perioperative setting,
right.
Or having very restricted beyond use states, which then would just equate to excessive drug waste if it wasn't used. And so essentially what was happening is we were flip-flopping, every week or even sometimes by the day, going up to the machines and taking the syringes out, the one or two that were there and putting the 10 vials. And so our providers was very disruptive as they would go and they didn't know, hey, am I going to have a vial of rocuronium today or am I going to have a syringe? And so that was very disruptive to patient care. And so that's when we really started to say, what can we do to ensure, again, we know ready-to-administer syringes are the safest product. What can we do to ensure that we always have supply? And that's
right.
when we really started looking into IV robotics.
Sure. And so leading right into that, you were part of the team at Cone Memorial Hospital when they adopted the RTA syringe protocol in the OR. Can you tell us what the biggest consideration and challenges were in that process and which drugs were among the first to be converted to RTA syringes?
Yeah, great question. Really, the first thing we did is we asked the OR providers and said, what are the most common drugs you use that, you're either seeing drug waste in or having it in a ready-to-administer form would help to expedite care because, case turnover was something that's really important to them, or being able to address emergency situations very quickly with drug administration. And so we came up with an initial kind of wish list of items that they had. And we were able to take a step back and look at that list and say, based off of how it's prepared, based off what, FDA vials are available, what made the most sense? Since we know the current IV robotics technology, it couldn't do everything. So we had to be selective on what we could do. And so we had that evaluation. We looked and we did a value analysis at the drug level to determine how many do we need, what's the capacity of the robots, what's the capacity of our program. And we came up with that initial kind of formulary list of syringes that we were going to provide. And rocuronium, I'll go back to that, was a great example because we actually never had a supply chain issue of getting the vials. And so when we were getting some of those allocations from 503Bs, we were looking at our shelf and say, we have plenty of vials that we could actually, use to make these syringes. And, we even asked, hey, 503B, could we send you our vials? And they said, no, FDA would not like that. It's, not a protected supply chain. And I get that. So that was kind of our aha moment of, hey, we're already doing a great job protecting the supply chain and ensuring we got these drugs on our shelf. So we already had the drugs there ready to go to do this. And so that was a huge consideration for us to get into this business. Now, there's a lot of safety pieces that go into this. Of course, you have to think about sterility. And so that's
right.
where the robots come in. They are a restricted access barrier system, providing that laminar ISO 5 air in a closed system where there's very minimal human interaction. And so again, that was thought to protect that critical transfer of a sterile drug into a sterile syringe and really just a repackaging event. But we also needed to consider the long-term stability since we are doing extended beyond use states with these. And
right.
so we partnered with our IV robot vendor to do full-on stability indicating method studies. Now, those studies are not inexpensive by any means. And so we actually worked within partnering with other institutions to co-fund some of these studies where then we could use those results since they're being prepared on the exact same robot in that same kind of controlled nature within that space to be able to use those data more broadly. And so we have the stability data, we have stability indicating methods using CGMP, and then we do sterility testing on every single batch. And so we're really essentially doing exactly what our 503Bs are doing to ensure the safety of these products.
Right. And the robotics technology, I imagine, allows you to do more faster. But step back for just a moment, because obviously, I mean, I hear you talking about the efficiency with using robots, and also I hear you talking about sterility, which of course is necessary, and stability testing, which leads me to believe that the FDA must have some sort of guidance around this process. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that you can just, for the sake of our listeners, talk a little bit about what those guidelines are and how they impacted your decision to do the things that you're doing now.
Sure. And I want to provide one quick clarification is that we don't get into IV robotics programs because they're more efficient. Because actually, I could put a compounding technician, in a room with a hood with a repeater pump, and they could easily be faster or more efficient in producing a higher number of doses than a robot could. And so that's actually one common myth around robots is thinking, they're going to go in there and have this high volume of production. And that's really not the case.
Okay.
And
so
essentially
maybe then?
Well, I'm sorry?
Is it the accuracy then that really is the benefit? Yeah.
Correct. So we think about the method of preparation and all of the steps that go into it. And it's a very methodical movements that occur for aseptic technique to ensure we're protecting the critical sites. Well, as humans, we get fatigued, right? So if we're doing that, maybe our technique can lapse and, we may block the airflow and may have a contaminated preparation. Well, with a robotic arm, we can program that arm of where the arm swings and ensuring that no movement will block that airflow. We can actually program how much pressure is the arm is grabbing the vial, how much air is put into the vial for displacement, the angle of the needle. Those are all the programming things that we work with our engineers to make sure that, hey, when we're drawing, 10 mLs of rock uranium to a syringe, we know that every single time it was done the same way.
Right. That makes sense.
From a human perspective, there's high variability, right? And so that is where our comfortability came in to be able to do this. I think in the absence of IV robots, I would not feel comfortable doing this just as a manual preparation because of some of those aforementioned reasons. And that, I guess, going on to your question with regulatory, that's where some of the FDA's concerns are with these.
Sure.
Is knowing that there's a high degree of variability out in the nation about what your clean room looks like, what types of hood you're using, the temperature, humidity, pressure of that. There's all of these variables that are out there since a hospital pharmacy is not under the purview of the FDA, it's under the purview of the states. They don't have some of the control of some of those variables, right? And we follow 797, which are minimum standards. And so the method of preparation to ensure to protect the sterility of those products is FDA's concern. And we see that in guidance documents. We see that in a lot of their language that's there. So they're releasing some guidance documents. And so we see a lot of them are still in draft, meaning that they're not enforceable currently. And they are just kind of FDA's current thinking on a topic. And so FDA recently did clarify that their hospital and health system guidance document is in draft and that they will be revising that to release a more final guidance document. But it's essentially trying to define the different scope of practice between a 503A, which is the hospital state, type of pharmacy, compared to the 503B, which is under the purview of the FDA, and then the manufacturers. And where are those lines between there? Well, I can say as a hospital leader and in this space that even with our 503Bs, right, that it's solving a critical need, and I think it is, there is still a gap. There is still a gap of need between what hospitals can do and what the 503Bs are there for, right? We think about our 503Bs being for profit, right? They're going to add things to their catalog that are financially, effective for them. Well, there's some drugs that we run that, we don't save money on it, but it's the right thing to do for our patients. And so there still is a gap between there. And that's where I think, in my opinion, where an IV robotics program with sterility testing and these chemical analysis to ensure we're doing it in the right way helps to fill in some of that gap. And so when you look into the regulations, specifically about robots, you're not going to see a lot. They're newer technologies, at least in the United States. These have been used in other countries for decades, but it doesn't say you can't use them and it doesn't say you can, right? It's just kind of this gray zone. And so that's why it's really important for folks like me who have the experiences to get out here and talk about it and share my experience and advocate with the FDA about what we're seeing with these. We've done over 900 sterility tests and 900 batches, and we haven't had a single sterility testing failure on any batch yet. So what are we doing with this data and to represent that this is a safe practice and to have a more widespread adoption of this technology in the nation?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's great that you are able to share this information and help develop best practices, for the entire industry. And as you have mentioned, Co-Memorial began insourcing, I should say, RTA syringes with IV robotics in the last couple of years. So you've got some time under your belt now. What have you seen as the biggest benefits to date?
So the biggest benefit, in my opinion, other than just the benefits of having a ready-to-administer product, like we talked about before, is we have not had to once since we've started this program for raw uranium switch back to the vials, right?
Nice.
And that to me is huge because we can expedite patient care and have the standardization that when that provider opens that tray, they know they're going to see that raw uranium syringe and they have trust in it. And we can use that. And so we have not had once to switch back to the vials. Now, it does put some pressure on me and my team because we have to deliver and we have to ensure we're looking at usages and trends of, as we have some seasonality in the hospital of, patients and obviously with COVID-19 of seeing influx of patients and surgeries and cases. And so really we protect the supply chain and with our preparation methods and how much we're doing that. And we're able to, our kind of method at that is we produce batches pretty frequently. And so, some folks will, from the outside will say, oh, Kevin's, manufacturing, he's got these robots, he's producing all these drugs, but we actually do smaller batch sizes. We just do them very frequently. And that's our way to be able to protect our supply chain. Is it more expensive to do it that way? Absolutely. Because we have to do more sterility testing on these batches and there's a lot additional efforts that are there. But if I'm, have a product that has, let's say, a 60-day beyond use date on it, we're still producing it every week. And we're able to put those in room temperature and put those into the automated dispensing cabinets. But the amount that we're producing in any given time is a much smaller amount. And that to me is what contrasts of what we see with 503Bs and our manufacturers who are going through and maybe doing 100,000 syringes in a batch, where we're doing 100 or 200. So that's really where the differences are of practice and some of the risks that you have comparing what we're doing at our site compared to what you would see at a manufacturer.
Sure. And so these RTA creations, are they, so it sounds like you are getting your top, based on what your OR is telling you and maybe some other departments, the top drugs that are used frequently. So they're not really patient specific. They're more developed knowing this is what we use a lot of. And excellent. Absolutely. And how are you monitoring quality and sterility of these products?
Yeah, so first and foremost, when we started this program, I did not bring it forward without having a quality assurance pharmacist. Quality and safety of this is of the utmost importance. It was not an efficiency or trying to save money. It was 100% a quality-driven process. And so I have a full-time quality assurance pharmacist, and we're continuously looking at how to improve the program. And even looking at, down to we went from 18 gauge needles to 21 gauge needles, and to really see the impact of reducing coring by having, a much smaller and fine needle that enters into the vial. Doing a visual inspection on every product that comes out of the robot. Using, light boxes and magnifying glasses to make sure that we can identify any types of things that are in there. Using sterility tests, using USP 71, which is the gold standard sterility test, and using our outsourcing lab, ARL in Oklahoma, who's been a great partner with us. They have a very high quality CGMP testing facility, and to ensure that we're accurately getting the best results out of our testing, and that we have confidence in those results that are coming out. And And even before the program began, we actually created a whole separate clean room for this process. And we didn't want to just meet the check boxes for the minimum standards of a clean room. We said, how can we exceed those standards? And so we got to meet with some folks who had some experience in designing clean rooms for FDA manufacturers in some of these areas, and we learned some key things. And there was a big focus on, when you design this clean room, of the flow of product and the flow of people, and ensure that they're all in this unidirectional kind of flow.
Right.
And so that really, we took some of that to heart, and we ended up implementing a scrub anteroom, which contained the sink and isolate space prior to going into the anteroom, where the dry garbing and sterile gloves were done, and then going into the clean room. So we essentially added another ISO classified chamber prior to even getting to the clean room. Further, of implementing HEPA filtered pass-throughs. So any type of things going in and out of the clean room had to go through HEPA filtered air. And looking at all the contamination and all the risk points, we really took into the fact of how could this protect the quality of the product. And so lots of forethought went into the design of that clean room space.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, you guys have invested in this heavily, for the long haul, but it sounds like you have developed some best practices now that are going to be very beneficial to everyone else in the industry. Sure. So kudos on making it this far and having it be as successful as it has been. And so taking into consideration the cost, the manpower and drug shortages that you mentioned, are there any RTA syringe medications that you continue to outsource outside of, this robotics, and what are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, we do. So we use a hybrid approach that we obviously insource, and we also continue to use our outsourcers. And so ISMP actually, I think, says it best. So they have a compounded sterile preparations guideline for pharmacy that's out there, and they list a few things of when we need to consider outsourcing. And so we looked at this, and this is how we provided this. So number one, it says outsourcing of the preparation of CSPs is considered as an alternative to in-house compounding when, so one would be the frequency of use for CSPs is very low, thus making it difficult to maintain staff competency. So that was the first thing we looked at. Are there complex things that maybe don't come up that often, but when they do, it's hard to keep staff trained. So that was the first thing that we looked at. The opposite end of that is the volume of the CSP is too high. Therefore, we would need additional staff or resources just to maintain those. So that's another area that we'll talk about. The third is the organization does not possess the technological or infrastructural resources to ensure the sterility of that. So that kind of hits on that other one, or where a commercially manufactured product is not available. So there are certain very high volume products that we use throughout our institution, and where those would take up pretty much the entire robotic space that we weren't able to provide the other products, is we looked at it in that way to say, well, let's continue to outsource this so we can free up the robot so we can provide these ready-to-administer syringes in the OR. And so we really then focused on protecting the OR space, and then anything outside of there is what we currently outsource. Now, the long-term plan is for the more simple ones that are more repackaging or simple transfers, we really see that's where our robots can fit in. But for these complex types of preparations, we will continue to use our 503B outsourced compounders.
Yeah, and so that makes sense. So, this is exciting technology, the robotics. You were, I would assume, one of the first hospital systems in the area to start using these in this manner. In the U.S., you mentioned that they're more commonly used outside. But in addition to the robotic technologies, what kind of staffing and logistical planning resources did you need to employ to reach production goals and the quality standards that you set, which obviously you put a lot of thought into? Yeah.
And there are certainly other hospitals in the nation and even within our state here of North Carolina that have IV robotics.
Okay.
And so before we started, we wanted to learn from what are they doing well and where are their gaps. And the number one thing that we saw is that in every site visit we went to, the robots were not running. And so we're kind of scratching our head to say, this is a huge investment.
Right.
Why are the robots not running? Right. And it came down to exactly what you just described. How do we keep folks trained to do this? Or maybe they broke down and we're waiting for the engineer to get on site, and all of these other reasons. And so that's where really helped to drive us of, what's a company, IV Robotics company we did business with, is the company that we worked with actually was able to have a subscription program where they provided trained robotic technicians. And so that was something that we saw as an advantage to remove that variable from our plate to say, how do we keep folks trained? Right. As our robotics vendors coming to us as a partner and saying, well, we will train the folks. We'll send them out to our headquarters. We will keep them trained. We'll have backup individuals, and we will ensure we're going to keep your robots running. And so that was a really important point for us, that we knew that if we're going to make this investment and get into this, I wanted to make sure the robots were running. So our program does run 4 days a week. Currently, we run Monday through Thursday across 2 shifts. So we start about 6 a.m. and we end close to 10:30, 11 p.m.
Sure.
And the reason we only do 4 days is we do want to have some catch-up days. So as we have increases in demand, or if we had any unplanned robot downtime, we needed to have some flex space.
Gotcha.
Because again, protecting that supply chain is really important. When we saw some of these 503Bs, they're operating either at their maximum capacity or even over their maximum capacity. So any shifts of demand created a shortage. And so that was essential for us to make sure that we had some of that fluff time to make up, to ensure we were meeting our product demands. And so it does take a lot of training, education, and following up to ensure the program is running, but working with your robotic vendor as a partner can be really important as well.
Absolutely. And I'm just curious, in follow up to that, did you have to change what you were doing? Did your team have to change during this pandemic at all, in terms of the types of medications you were, create the syringes you were creating, the time that you spent doing, with your robotics team, making new batches? Talk a little bit about that, because I'm just interested how it might have changed, or if it did at all.
Yeah, no, great question. We had to remain very flexible. And there's for all the shortages and increased demand for these ICU patients going through, fentanyl infusions and norepinephrine and everything to keep these critical patients alive. We took a step back and said, do we stop producing anything on the robot that we're doing today to pick up some of these?
Right.
Or do we work into overtime on some of these fluff days to make up for that? And we have an outstanding robotics team in quality assurance, and we were able to fit it in. We were able to continue without stopping protocols, and we were able to fit in some of these critical ICU infusions to help out. Actually, we opened up a whole nother hospital to take care of these COVID patients, and we were able to compound all of these types of infusions and supply it to this hospital to ensure that we could treat these patients well. And so our IV robotics program was essential during that time, because throughout the piece as well, it was difficult to maintain staffing. As folks, let's say have a cold, well, they may need to be out of work to have that differentiated to say, is this COVID-19 or is this allergies or other related things? And so there were some staffing challenges during that time. And so we were able to make it through, and the robots were absolutely very helpful during that time.
That's amazing. Yeah. So, it's another positive, because it shows that you can still meet the demand even in a health crisis like this, which I think is so important. And we can't say that we saw that in some other areas of our supply chain, throughout this crisis. So that's amazing. In closing, Kevin, I know you're super busy and I don't want to hold you too long, but I thank you so much for sharing all of this information and your experience with us today. And just as we get ready to wrap up here, I wanted to ask if there were any, last thoughts or suggestions you'd like to share with our listeners, especially if they are looking to implement a program like this where they are.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it starts with going out and seeing a place that has it, right? That's really what started us. We had the thought, we had the idea, and we had never seen it in operations. And so we partnered with other hospitals and we were able to get in to see it in action. And it really just built our excitement on just the possibilities. And we also, had the time to learn, the pros and cons of, what, different groups are doing. But, hearing about drug shortages and hearing benefits for folks that have robot programs to say, we were able to get through that shortage and it wasn't that impactful. And then hearing about some hospitals that don't have robotics programs, and they were like, that was a very difficult shortage to get through. And I think hearing and learning from some of those stories, it just starts with going out and looking and saying, what does our IV program look like? And it's really different at each institution you go to. It could, because your goals could be to reduce your 503B outsourcing to protect that supply chain, but it could be on the opposite. It could be, hey, we don't have staff to manually produce these, so we need to reduce just the manual compounding that we're doing now. And so it really, you need to start with saying, what is our goal? What are we trying to achieve? Sure. And then how can robots start that? I think if you start with a good goal and go in, you can see that there's many benefits for how IV robots can fit in. And two, we had this myth too of, IV robots are so large, they're massive, there's no way we could even fit this in. Well, robots come in all different sizes and shapes, and they all do very different things and have different capacities. We were able to find one that was a sufficient size that we could actually put into most of our clean rooms within our health system.
Excellent.
And so, maybe just going out and exploring and looking, I think could really help to maybe identify and address some of those myths you have and see that, hey, maybe this actually is something we can put on our roadmap.
So for first steps, then it sounds like really do your research, explore, learn all that you can, and then plan, because everything I've heard you talk about today has really just been around good planning on, your team's part, because you really understood what you were trying to achieve, what space you had to work with, and all of the different challenges that might happen, and come up with a plan for all of it before you even brought a robot in the door, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. Lots of planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Well, this has been great to learn more. I've learned a lot today, and I want to thank you so much for your time, Kevin. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, of course. I also want to give a big shout out to my producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. If you enjoyed today's episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.
IVT's Validation Week is going virtual for 2020 this October. Not to be confused with a single presentation webinar or Zoom training, Val Week 2020 brings a completely virtual 3-day conference experience. With nearly 30 expert speakers and a combination of live and on-demand sessions crafted with your time in mind, the caliber of training content is unrivaled. Hear from top pharma, biotech, and medical device subject matter experts, gain exclusive insights from FDA speakers, build up your team's validation toolkit with take-home checklists and materials, and leverage unlimited networking opportunities with colleagues and key decision makers. Plus, claim up to 15 credit hours toward GMP training requirements. You won't want to miss it. Visit www.informaconnect.com/validation week for all details on agenda and registration. Once again, that's www.informaconnect.com/validation-week for all event details.